This morning's message is on the life-shaping power of promise. We're in a series called Made for More. We started 2 weeks ago looking at the reality that we're made in God's image. We looked at Genesis chapter 1, and we saw that God has made us for freedom. He's made us for authority. He made us to tend the garden. He made us in His image. He made us to represent His kingdom here on earth. We talked about how being human, being created in God's image, means that we're to reflect the freedom and authority of heaven into this world, and that we're to reflect the praise and thanks of all creation, not just like our own lives, but all creation back to God our King. So there's this high call, a high reality to being made human that a lot of us undervalue, a lot of us undershoot in terms of like what it means to be a human being. And then last week we talked about the Garden of Eden, and we talked about how Adam and Eve in that garden story, many people know they kind of ate the fruit. They went over a line that God had set, but we saw that sin is not just a matter of crossing a boundary, but it's giving up our responsibility as image bearers. That at the very core, we were supposed to be tending the garden, not taking direction. So rather than sort of exercising the freedom and authority of the kingdom of God, we abdicated that and we took direction from the serpent. And we talked about whenever we give up our role, whenever we take direction from creation, whenever the fancy word for that is idolatry. Whenever something in this world has authority over us that it's not meant to have, we end up in a condition of exile. We end up losing access to God's presence in ways that bewilder us and hurt us. This week, we're going to jump forward a few chapters to Abraham, and we're going to look at the power of promise. But I want to start, before we read Genesis, the end of 11 and 12, just by resetting the reality that promises have the power to shape our lives, don't they? Promises form us. Promises shape us. I've been thinking a lot about this because our oldest son is about to get married. Now, I was thinking back to when Michelle and I got engaged. And when we got engaged, it was, a joyful time of life. We were on dates all the time. We were looking forward to marriage. We were talking about our honeymoon. We were like so excited about what we were going to do together in the next chapter of our lives together. And our parents were talking all about responsibility, like, where are you guys going to live? And we're like, whatever, we're going on a great honeymoon. We'll figure that out. And then, we had jobs. I was working at a thrift store Coast Town, so I had a job, and they'd say, what are you going to do for work? And it's like, newsflash, Mom and Dad, I have a job. But what's your real job going to be? And so there was sort of a setback, like, oh, my parents don't think I have a real job. And they asked questions about health insurance and all these questions. And throughout our engagement, I remember vowing to myself, like repeatedly, when I grow up and when we have kids, I am not going to be like my parents. I am not going to just be all about responsibility. Like, I'm just going to encourage my kids and cheer for my kids. So our oldest just got engaged, and he comes back. We just had the greatest date. We went out. It was so fun. And I find myself, so where are you going to live, Daniel? I don't care about the date. Like, let's talk brass tacks now. What are you doing? And, where are you going to work? And that influences where you live, and like, you're getting married, you have to step up to the plate. And I find myself, in looking back, I think, man, my parents were so low key. How were they that gracious with me? Like, I just don't think this is acceptable. Like, don't bring me this stuff. Like, you are getting married. You better be mature today, not tomorrow. But underneath that is the reality that when we commit our lives to each other, that promise of engagement shapes our direction, doesn't it? It shapes where we live. It shapes how we think about decisions. And as I look back, I think, boy, there's nothing that's been probably more life-shaping than the promise Michelle and I made to marry. If you saw the article, that there's a government program, which we're also aware of because of our life stage, that if you work for 10 years in the public sector rather than the private sector, the U.S. government will forgive your college loans, which at this stage of college tuition is a big deal. So as parents with kids in college, we're like telling all our kids, you should consider public sector work, like work in a public high school for 10 years and your University of California debt will be forgiven. This is a good deal, right? And a lot of people over the last several years have changed their whole work direction based on that. Unfortunately, this week the federal government reconsidered whether they're actually going to forgive the loans. And so even though you've been working for 8 or 9 years, the government's like, you know what, maybe not, sorry. Thanks for your public sector work. So that's still up in the air right now. But part of the heat and underneath the debate is like, wait a minute, this shaped people's lives. This shaped where they live. This shaped their career. There was a promise of debt forgiveness. You can't take away that promise because it shaped their lives. Promises shape lives. But for however much like promises we might receive from the government or from a fiance might shape our lives, the most shaping promises are the promises of God. There are not promises that can shape our whole direction and destiny more than those. And the Bible is filled with people like Peter, whose life was shaped, like a young peasant woman named Mary, whose life was totally shaped and reshaped. A young woman named Elizabeth, Mary's cousin, whose life was shaped by a promise given by God. God loves to give promises, and he loves to actually take us from places of being stuck, from places of wandering, from places of insecurity or disappointment. He loves to take us into an abundant quality of life and actually an eternal quality of life by giving promises. We're going to look at Abraham this morning and his wife Sarah and the promise that God gave to them. And before we read the text, let's pray. Jesus, we love you and we thank you for the promises you speak into our lives. Jesus, you are the Alpha of everything. You are the author and the beginner of every one of our stories. Your goodness, Lord, is the foundation of everything that is. And Jesus, you're the Omega, Lord. We are all headed towards you. Every person here, Lord, every person in our city and on this earth, Lord, we are headed towards you. You are our destiny. Lord, would you help us to drink in your word this morning? Would you help us to digest it, Lord? Would you fill our lives with the reality of your promises? And would you give us faith to trust you? In your name, Jesus, amen. All right, we're going to start at the end of Genesis 11. Now, Sarai, and her name changes to Sarah a little bit later. Now, Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. Terah took his son Avram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Avram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they had come to Haran, they settled there, and the Lord said to Avram, leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. And Avram's name changes to Abraham, so I'm going to call him Abraham this morning, FYI. This is God's call, their promise. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So Avram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Avram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they accumulated, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. And Avram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Avram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. I want to walk through this passage with you and sort of dig into it, but I want to begin by thinking a little bit about Sarah. We find out later in the text that she's 10 years younger than Abraham. We find out she's a beautiful woman. They have a lot of stuff. I think that in some ways Sarah was a person that a lot of people would have envied. She had a life with a lot of resources. She was known, it seems like, really nationally for her beauty, the sort of person that you get the feeling that people in the ancient world could have envied, except the only sentence we get about her in the beginning is that she was barren. She couldn't have children. And it's interesting to me that this huge promise that really starts the ball rolling for like the rest of the story of God's promise and faithfulness in the entire Bible starts with this statement not about Abraham but about Sarah. And sometimes I think when we read the Bible, we read quickly and forget, like, wait, what's in the verse I just read? And I want to pause because there's a reality for Sarah of grief. There's a reality of a woman who's past childbearing age, and I know some of us in this room have struggled with infertility or even our past struggle into just that childbearing hasn't been a reality where it was hoped for. And I don't think there's a lot more painful in this life. And I can imagine the emotional pain that she carried day to day. We find out later that her relationship with Abraham is, there's conflict around the reality that they haven't been able to have kids. And so it's not just an emotional weight, but it's probably hurt some of her relationships, certainly her relationship with Abraham. It's made it messy, to say the least. And I imagine that for Sarah, there were some real, whatever her sort of background of worship was, that there were some spiritual questions too. Like if there is a God, it was probably challenging to believe in the goodness of God. And if you read Genesis 18, you see that Sarah struggles to believe the goodness of God with respect to herself. And sometimes life not only feels empty, because it's not just that Sarah felt barren, it's that she wasn't able to have kids. And sometimes our desires don't happen. And so there's this reality of emptiness into which God speaks. And the staggering thing about this text is how almost nonchalant God is. Sometimes we think of God as good and caring and merciful, and all that is true, but sometimes God has this like tremendous nonchalance, right? I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to make you into a great nation, and I almost feel like a kid in the classroom, like, wait a minute, God, newsflash, I have a question. We're past the age of childbearing, like, great nation. Where did that come from? How could that possibly happen? And God doesn't even, sort of say, hey guys, don't worry. I know that you've been carrying this grief. I know that you haven't been able to have kids, but I'm going to do a miracle. He just says, he just gives them the promise. And so there's this real tension with Sarah's reality, Abraham's reality, and the promise. And sometimes the promises of God hit us almost like a truck. Like just wham, here's the promise. Your reality might be full of pain, but wham, the energy of the promise of God. You are going to be a great nation, and your name is going to become great in all of the earth, and every nation on the earth is going to be blessed through you. How much bigger of a promise can you even imagine? I mean, that's staggering, right? Can you imagine God saying to one of us, actually all the nations of the earth? If you said to a friend over coffee, my weekend was really great. Yeah, why was your weekend great? Well, I was praying and God spoke to me. Oh, cool. What did God say? Well, God actually said that, actually every nation on the planet is going to be blessed through me. So that was cool. I'm excited about that. How would you feel? That's like, okay. We just went past arrogance into like a whole nother dimension, right? Like very few of us would even want to repeat that because it seems so audacious. And we live in a globalized world where we can actually conceive of like going to different nations. And we live in a globalized world where like, hey, you could have an idea like Mark Zuckerberg and, start social media, 3.0 that actually might bless people on every nation of the earth. That's like possible in this room. And yet it would be audacious to say all the nations are going to be blessed through me. Abraham and Sarah physically couldn't have in their lifetime traveled even a few of the nations on earth. It's just a staggering, huge promise. But what I want to start with this morning is that God's promise is the key to living as image bearers. And I want to connect this with the last couple of weeks where we've been. Look at Genesis 1. So God created human beings in his own image, and God blessed them and said, be fruitful. So this is the image-bearing call of God. He blessed us all, and he said, be fruitful and increase, fill the earth and subdue it. And we talked about the freedom that God gives us when he says, let them rule and fill the earth and take care of it. And so the authority that God gives us, shortly after this text, he has Adam name the animals. There's this free exercise of kingly authority that's given to us. And then we kind of give it up and blow it, and things unravel. And now in Genesis 12, God says to Abraham, I'll make you into a great nation. I'll bless you. I'll make your name great. Everybody on earth is going to be blessed through you. But what I want you to see is that God's restoring the capacity of people to live in his image. There's a restoration at work. You sort of gave up your responsibility, but the promise of God is what's going to take people there. It's not that people figured out, oh, we gave up our responsibility, we have to go back to how God designed us. The reality is that God spoke into our lives. When we had blown it, God speaks a promise in and sort of resets our whole identity and purpose. And that was true for Abraham, but it's also true today, that God speaks promise into our lives and restores us to the identity he made us for to begin with. And so part of the idea under this whole sort of journey we're on headed towards Easter is that Jesus is in the business of restoring us to live how we were designed to live, not only now, but forever. And that he's restoring the freedom and the authority we were meant to have from the very beginning, and that we've all given up for different reasons. I want to look at 4 things we need in order to experience God's promise. And another way of saying this, I thought about writing, what does faith really look like? So we actually really need faith. The Bible saying is you don't need 4 things, you need 1 thing. But this passage shows us that faith is actually complex on the ground. And there's different pieces of faith that I want to look at. So in looking at these 4 things, you can hold that together with they're actually parts of the one thing that the Bible calls faith or trust. So here they are, 4 things, and this comes right out of the text. The first is a willingness to leave. The Lord said to Abraham, I'm just going to forget the Abraham part because his name gets changed and it's easier. Leave your native country, your relatives and your father's family, and go to the land that I'll show you. And then 3 verses later, the Bible says Abraham left. And so the very beginning of God's promise is this call to departure. Leave behind. If you look at sort of the Bible as a whole, you see that very often God starts by calling us to leave. Jesus says, leave your nets and follow me. Again and again, when Jesus confronts people face to face, he says, sort of, leave your life as you know it and follow me. That's a summary of almost all of Jesus' initial encounters with people, whether it's Peter or James or John or the woman at the well or the Gerasene demoniac in Mark chapter 5. It's leave that and follow me. And to Abraham, he says, leave your native country. So that's like the big picture, right? They get more intimate, right? I'm calling you to leave your homeland, your native country, leave your father's family, leave your tribe, your extended network of relationships, and your relatives, and then your father's family is sort of the most intimate circle. I'm calling you to leave behind your past. I'm calling you to a radical departure. I'm calling you to a risky departure. I'm calling you to leave your comfort zone. I'm calling to leave all the norms that you know. When I first started following Jesus, it was really clear that for me, leaving meant leaving drugs. Some of us can tell, boy, when I heard the call of Jesus, I needed to leave self-hatred. I need to leave chemical use. I need to leave anger. Sometimes there's a thing that's like, you need to leave it. But there's also a continual process of leaving, I think, in following Jesus, that he's calling us to a new place, and he's calling us to leave behind some things. Something I think Jason a few weeks ago gave a really important message when he talked about seeing San Diego as home and not just as a place of exile. What would it look like to treat this as a sort of God's assignment for us? And I was realizing that I think for many of us, there's a leaving behind a worldview where we're just passing through. And I think that as a church right now, God is not only calling us to love the city, but in doing that, to root in. There's a recent book out that has a great title. I love it. It says, culture, that as a church, a leaving that God is calling us to do is calling us to leave a culture of transition and sort of rootlessness, and to actually love our communities and our workplaces. That doesn't mean that God will never move us on in the future, but to treat our neighbors as neighbors and not just random happenstance people that we're going to live next to for a little while and then move on. Does that make sense? It's a worldview. I think our culture has a worldview where life is transitory, relationships are transitory, and we don't really invest because we're always moving on to the next thing whenever the next thing is good for us. And I think that, I'm speaking sort of as a church right now, I think that something we're called to leave right now is that whole worldview into a more rooted, a more grounded, I'm going to invest here because this is where I'm assigned. I'm going to invest here because if we're called to love our city together, that means some sense of like deep intentionality and an ability to look into the future with our neighbors and with our coworkers, an ability to think, what would my company flourishing look like? What would this campus flourishing look like, not only today, but tomorrow and the next year and the next year? But I think for all of us, faith means departure. It means a willingness to leave, and that can be hard. Some of us don't want to leave behind. Some of us want to stay. Second one is a willingness to go. So God calls him to leave, but then he not only calls him to depart, he gives Abraham a direction. Go to the land that I will show you. Now, here's the frustrating thing about God. It's super frustrating. God is sometimes, I think one of the best adjectives for God is frustrating. We don't usually talk about that. But God is frustrating. Go to the land I will show you. What is that? Like, tell me. You know where it is, God. Where am I going? Don't you want to know that? Like, I want to know where I'm going. What should I pack for the journey? Don't just tell me to go. Tell me where I'm going. I am Myers-Briggs INFJ. Like, I want to know so I can decide. I'm a decider. If you're an INFP, this is okay. You know, if you're a perceiver, if you can just go with the flow, then this is an okay command. But if you want to be able to decide, like, is that future better than the land I'm living in? I have to know where I'm going. And yet, very consistently, God doesn't tell us where we're going. He just says, go, and I'm going to show you the land when you get there. So there's this real element of trust, isn't there? And Abraham just has to step into that. And then a few verses later, Abraham takes everyone. He takes all the people in his extended family. He takes all his stuff, and he goes. He goes all in. So we have to have a willingness to go, even though we don't know where we're going. If you were at the Loving the City into Life conference a month ago, Catherine Scott shared a story about investing in a neighbor for 8 years. And she shared a story about how she initially felt this strong sense from God that she was supposed to invest in her neighbor, love her neighbor, invited her neighbor to church a few times, and nothing happened, but still had a sense that she was supposed to invest. She stopped talking to the neighbor at all about God, stopped inviting the neighbor to church, and just for year after year after year, just invested in and cared for that neighbor. And then after 8 years, she had a sense of kind of an open door. And one Easter said, hey, do you want to come to church this Easter? And the neighbor said yes, after 8 years of investment. And then if you were at the conference, the cool part of the story is that neighbor then led someone to faith, who led someone else to faith, who led someone else to faith. And they had a service with a whole string of people that had come to faith through that relationship. But it started with 8 years of investment. And when I heard that story, on the one hand, I was encouraged. On the other hand, I thought, boy, I would love to see us as a church have the kind of fortitude, like we're just going to keep investing. I'm going to keep investing in my workplace. I'm going to keep investing in my neighbor. I'm going to keep investing in my sister. I'm going to keep investing in my mom. I know it doesn't seem like it's going anywhere, but I sense an assignment from Jesus to go there. So again, I don't think that going is always physical, but sometimes it's a sense of, I'm supposed to invest here, and you just got to keep going. And Abraham had to keep journeying until the Lord showed him he was there. We want to keep investing. Another sort of sideline, this week Rick Love called me. Some of you know Rick. He's the CEO of Peace Catalyst International. He's one of the foremost experts in the country on Christian-Muslim relationships. And he said, basically, he called to find out, like, how have you gone so far in your relationship with the mosque? And he said he's worked with churches all over the country and said he just doesn't see churches really develop rich friendships with mosques. And I thought, when we started the relationship with our neighbors at ICSD years ago, I would never have guessed where we were going. And I've said to people so many times, I don't know where this is going. I've had other pastors and other people, like, that's a cool story, but where is it going? And I always wish that I had an answer for that question. I still wish I had an answer for that question. I wish, like, right now, standing here, I had an answer for that question. And I don't have an answer for that question. I have new hopes. We've got a lot of friends. We've had chances to talk about Jesus and share faith and do life together and even bless our city together. And I think there will be more of those. But I don't actually know where it's all going. And the reason I share that is to say that made comfort zone into some place we're not familiar with. Someplace we wouldn't have even chosen. It's not like Abraham was having lunch with Sarah saying, man, it would be really great if we lived on the Mediterranean coast instead of here in Iraq, wouldn't it? That would be great. Abraham wasn't having that conversation with Sarah. God just spoke to him and said, leave, and you're going basically west. Oh, okay, God, go west. Great, thanks. Philip in the book of Acts, God says, sometimes God just uses directions. Philip, go south. How would you like to tell your friends, hey guys, I'm going south? Yeah, what do you mean you're going south? What are you going to do? I was praying and God said, go south. Okay, well, we're going to pray for you, first of all. Like, what did you have for breakfast? Have you been having any other things that God's been saying to you? But that's what God said to Philip, go south. He didn't say you're going to have a continent-shaping conversation with an Ethiopian court official. That would have been nice if he had said that. But he didn't say that. He just said to Philip, go south. And so Philip had to tell his friends, hey guys, I'm going south. And then he went south. And on the way, he had an encounter with an Ethiopian court official that historically we can say started to reshape North Africa. It was incredibly significant, even in a sort of global socio-political sense. And yet you would never have guessed that from that initial thing. And so God calls us into stuff without letting us know here's where it's going. And that's, I think, happening in different ways. And there's people at Coast, God's speaking to you about workplace, God's speaking to you about neighborhood, God's speaking to you about a ministry idea. Abby had an idea for an Easter egg hunt. I don't know where it's going, but there's a sense of like, we want to step into it. And even as Krista shared during worship, there's a lot of new things God's saying to us, and the willingness we need to have is to go. Okay, by faith, Abraham went. He obeyed and he went, even though he did not know where he was going. This is Hebrews 11, sort of looking back on Genesis. Faith means going when you don't know where you're going. Okay, third, a willingness to receive. So the first part of the promise is the command to depart. The second part of the promise is this direction. I want you to go. And then God says, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and I will make your name great. And notice I highlighted the I wills. God is just saying to Abraham, I'm going to do it. You're going to go and I'm going to do it. It's not like go and what you're going to do. It's go and I'm going to make you a great nation and I'm going to bless you. And I'm going to make your name great. So that puts Abraham and Sarah in a posture of receiving. Okay, we're going to go, and then we're going to receive. But I think that one of the real challenges for some of us is actually the willingness to receive. I think for some of us, we'd be a lot more willing to do it if we knew we got to do it. I think that the struggle that Brian shared is a struggle that a lot of us can relate to. I certainly relate to it. There's a struggle like to just say, I need help. There's a struggle to receive prayer. There's a struggle to say to God, okay, here's my marriage, here's my life, I need help. In a lot of ways, for some of us at least, it's a lot safer to be in charge than to trust that God's going to do it. And at the end of the day, faith is a willingness to receive. Faith is a willingness to say, okay. And I can imagine, for Abraham and Sarah, can you imagine communicating to your family, to your extended household, God has promised us that we're going to be a great nation. Speaking as a woman unable to have children, it must have been so hard even to repeat, even to acknowledge that God's going to do a miracle for me. It's very hard. It's easy to read about it or to celebrate it on behalf of someone else. It's hard to say, I actually believe God's going to do a miracle in my life that I desperately need and want and that I have no control over at all. And yet that's what God calls them to this place of not being in control. And so for some of us, you're going to be called into things where God has to do it and where you can't control the outcome. And if you're a control freak like me, then that's just like horrible. It's much better to be able to be in control than to say, I'm going to go and God's going to have to fulfill this promise on his own, as it were. Okay. Last one, we're going to finish now. And then there's a change in the text. So those things are things God's going to do. And then the fourth, and this is carefully phrased, is a willingness to be a blessing. And we're going to do 30 seconds of Hebrew here. Everybody will survive. This part has grammar in it, which is worse than usual for a lot of you. But nevertheless, I trust you will not die. In Hebrew, you can tell not only the tense of a verb, like is it past, present, or future, but you can tell the mood of the verb, which means you can tell whether it's a suggestion, you can tell whether it's a command, you can tell whether it's a hypothetical, just by the way the word is spelled. And so God says, I will make you great. It's a promise, and it's a future statement. I'm going to make your name great. He says, I'm going to bless you, and it's a promise, and it's a future statement. I'm going to make your name great. Same promise, future statement in the Hebrew. And then he gives a command that almost no English translations go with, which is really strange to me. He says, and be a blessing, but it's a command to you. And the command is the word be. Be a blessing. I'm going to do these things, and you, command, imperative, be a blessing. Which is a remarkable switch. And what God's saying, I think, to Abraham is, I'm commanding your identity. I'm going to do all this on your behalf, but you are to live in the identity of being a blessing. He doesn't command Abraham to bless others here. He commands Abraham to be a blessing. And only God would speak commands to our identity, right? It's kind of like commanding you to be a different height or good at something you're not. Like, how can I do that? But it's a command to Abraham's identity. Be a blessing. In other words, live in the image of God. I designed you for this, now you live in that. And not just do a few tasks, not just be generous occasionally, but be a blessing in who you are. And then there's a promise that comes in the next verse, and all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed through you. And that's back to future, that's just a promise. But the command to Abraham is right to the core of who he is. God's speaking that command, now be a blessing. And I was thinking about, I was chewing on this verse this week. And like, what does that mean? And how do you receive a command to be a blessing? And then something that happened is a few people came to mind that just are blessings. I thought there's a woman in the Vineyard, sort of one of the matriarchs of our movement. Her name's Evelyn Wagner. And I thought, her face just came to mind. And I realized that every time I've been with her, without fail, she encourages me for reasons that don't make any sense to me. Just walks up, Jamie, blah, blah, blah. You know, God's doing, he's just doing great things, or speaking of different things in my character and in my life, and it's just like all she has to say. And I realize that every time I'm around her, I just feel like a better person. It's really weird. You know, there's just that, man, she's just a blessing all the time. There's people in our lives, and there's people in this room who just, you are a blessing, just a blessing all the time. I was thinking about, there's a Ghanaian man, a few of you have met, his name is Charles Abavari. He lived with us for a while. He's just a relentless blessing. He just won't stop encouraging people. Just every time I'm around him, every time he Facebooks me, he'll just say, I got a Facebook message a little while ago, Jamie, I'm just praising God for you. He lives in Alabama, or lives in Mississippi, not Alabama, lives in Mississippi now. Like, how many people Facebook that? That's so weird. But he's just like constitutionally incapable of not being a blessing. And it's somewhat irritating, actually, because it actually makes me feel like a bad person sometimes. Like, he's just fundamentally incapable of saying a bad word to people. It's who he is. He just is a blessing. And this is what God is speaking to Abraham. Be a blessing. Be a blessing. I'm going to bless you. Now be a blessing. I think that one thing God would say to us as a community is be a blessing. I'm going to bless you. Be a blessing. The Easter egg hunt. Be a blessing. Just be one. Let our lives as a church, let our small groups, let our ministries just be a blessing. In your workplace, be a blessing tomorrow at the same time. You know, at 11:20 tomorrow, be a blessing. When you're with family, be a blessing. There's a command part that we're to live into. Like, okay, Jesus, make me a blessing. You have blessed me, and now help me to live in the identity that I'm designed for, which is to be a blessing everywhere I go, with everyone I meet, because the Lord my God has blessed me. Right? Because I am the recipient of blessing, I have the resources to be a blessing wherever I am. And of course, for Sarah, it's like this really counterintuitive. I think for a lot of us, the challenge here, and the reason I put a willingness, is I think a lot of us might disqualify ourselves saying, you know what, I'm empty. My marriage is stuck. I'm out of resources. I'm out of time. I just don't have the time to be a blessing to my neighbor, to this person. Some of us might say, there's a sense of barrenness that's gotten a hold of our soul that causes us to believe we're not in a position to be a blessing. And Abraham is commanding Sarah, or God is commanding Sarah and Abraham, together, you guys, be a blessing. Even though I can imagine Sarah and Abraham saying back to God, do your homework, God. We don't have children. We can't have children. We'll never be able to have children. In Genesis 18, Sarah laughs at God, right? When God says, okay, now's the time, you're going to have a child, Sarah laughs, and she says something that's kind of hilarious. She's like, am I going to have that pleasure? And you can tell, like, it was kind of like, God, we had a lot of fun trying to have kids, and now we know that's not going to be the kind of joy we have. Am I ever going to have that pleasure? And God says, why did you laugh? And she says, I didn't laugh. And then he says, yes, you did. I was listening. But underneath that is Sarah's reality, like, how am I going to be a blessing? Like, I wanted to be a blessing, and I tried to have a family, and actually it was great, but I'm not going to, God. That's the reality. That's the reality. And yet God says, oh, no, you have another thing coming. Actually, you are. You are. And actually, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed through your family. Now, here's the last thing this morning. We'll close here. This is Galatians. He redeemed us. That is, Jesus redeemed us in order that, and here comes the staggering part I talked about earlier, wouldn't it be really audacious to in any way think that promise given to Abraham had something to do with us? Wouldn't that be audacious? Wouldn't it be crazy to believe that actually God wanted to bless the nations of the earth through us? Jesus redeemed us in order that the blessing given to Abraham might come to the Gentiles, that's everybody who's not Jewish, through Christ Jesus, so that by faith we might receive the promise of the Spirit. And so, in other words, the promise given to Abraham, comes to us through Jesus. When we say yes to Jesus, the promise given to Abraham becomes our promise, and we step into that story. And so as a church community, this is our story. We're called to be a blessing. We're called to leave the past, to follow Jesus, but we're aiming toward that destiny where we are all a blessing together because of what Jesus has done on the cross, opening up this promise to all of us. Let's all stand. Worship team, if you guys could come on up. Let's pray. Lord, I ask that you would speak to us now and encourage us. Just coming off where we started this morning and Brian's sharing about just new hope and life in his marriage, we want to pray this morning as we're going to worship, and then there will be a chance to get prayer. And one thing we want to pray for sure this morning is marriages. And just keep on that theme. But for the last couple days as I've been praying, I felt the Lord saying one thing pretty consistently, and that's there's a lot of Sarahs in this room. There's a lot of Sarahs. You might, it's really tender and fragile to say this, you might relate to Sarah because of a inability to have children. You might relate to Sarah because you feel barren in some other way in your life. And it might be more than a feeling. You might be able to say, I am. If you're feeling, whether you're a woman or a man, if you're feeling barren, feeling empty, if you're feeling like you've tried hard and it just didn't work, we want to pray for you. I think there's another group that God's calling you to new steps, just as Chris has said. There's something new that you know God's doing, and there's a step that you're supposed to take, and we want to just pray over that and bless that. So let's worship, and then we'll respond in a minute. And folks on the prayer team, if you guys could come on up, if you're equipped to pray, and if you'd like prayer, I'm going to close this in just a second, but we'd love to just invite anyone who would want prayer to get prayer. Most important beginning for any of us is not marriage, it's not actually birth, it's when we open our hearts up to God for the very first time and stepping into the promise of God begins with an opening of our hearts. And if you've never asked Jesus into your heart, this morning could be a morning to begin a spiritual journey that shapes your destiny forever. I'd love to pray with you. If you know you're at the beginning of a spiritual journey, we want to pray with you this morning. Let's hold hands across the aisles. Do this each week as a reminder that we're a community. We're a community that lives under the banner of God's promise. We're a community that God has purposed to bless, that is called to be a blessing. Jesus, we love you and we receive your promise. This week, would you help us and empower us and encourage us to be a blessing in our family relationships and with our friends, the co-workers, and all the people you bring across our path tomorrow. Would you help us to be a blessing? Lord, would you help us to believe your promise on the days when it's hardest? Would you help us to believe your promise when we're hurting and when we feel empty? Would you help us to believe your promise when we feel alone or frustrated or desperate? Would you give us faith beyond our circumstances that we might follow you and shine for you in this world? God, in your name, Jesus. Amen. God bless you guys. If you'd like prayer for anything at all, come on up. We'd love to pray with you. If you're headed out, have a fantastic week.